By the winter of 1941, in one of Europe's largest cities, a person could still be killed for a crust of bread. Leningrad had not been conquered. It had simply been cut off, sealed in, and left to starve. More than 2 million civilians were trapped behind the lines. In November, some of them were surviving on bread rations as low as 125 grams a day. The temperature could fall to minus 20 degrees Celsius, and sometimes even lower. There was no reliable heat, little electricity, almost no transport, and no certainty that help would reach them in time. The siege would last 872 days, and for the people inside the city, the first question was not how to defeat the blockade, it was how to survive the next week. Before the encirclement closed, Leningrad was still one of the great cities of the Soviet Union, dense with factories, apartment blocks, trams, libraries, schools, and the routines of urban life. It stood on the Baltic approaches and remained connected to the wider Soviet interior by rail lines and water routes, above all through the region around Lake Ladoga. In June 1941, when Germany invaded the Soviet Union, that ordinary world did not vanish at once. For a time, people still went to work, still stood in queues, still imagined that the front might be held somewhere far beyond the city. But the military map was changing quickly. German forces approached from the west and south, Finnish forces from the north. The ring around Leningrad did not close in a single dramatic blow. It tightened piece by piece. And that gradual tightening made the danger easy to underestimate, until the last links began to break. One date mattered more than most. On August 29, 1941, the capture of Maga cut the last railway line connecting the city to the rest of the Soviet Union. Then, on the 8th of September, the fall of Schlisselburg completed the encirclement. From that point on, Leningrad's survival became a logistical impossibility that somehow had to be managed anyway. A city built to be supplied by rail, road, and industry was now dependent on far narrower routes, especially across Lake Ladoga. That lake would become the city's lifeline. But at the moment the blockade closed, it was not enough to save the city from immediate catastrophe. Food reserves were disastrously low. Some accounts suggest they would have lasted only days under normal consumption. And now, normal consumption was over. At first, the threat came in visible forms. Air raids struck heavily during the early months. Artillery shelling followed. Buildings were damaged. Fires broke out. People ran to shelters and returned to streets that looked less certain than they had the day before. But the bombardment, deadly as it was not what would define Leningrad's ordeal. The central fact of the siege was slower and less cinematic. The city was being starved. Its people were not facing one disaster, but a chain of them. Supply failure, ration cuts, transport collapse, fuel collapse, cold, disease, exhaustion, and the long psychological pressure of living in a place where almost everything necessary for life was disappearing at once. And the worst of it had not even begun. Winter was still coming. The ration system was the first brutal acknowledgement of reality. As supply shrank, the authorities reduced daily food allowances to starvation levels. In November 1941, depending on one's category, a person might receive between 125 and 375 grams of bread per day. Even that bread was poor in quality. To modern ears, the word bread can sound reassuring, almost substantial. In Leningrad that winter, it was neither. It was not enough to sustain health, strength, or work. It was enough only to delay collapse. And because so much of survival now centered on ration cards, those small slips of paper became as important as food itself. To lose one could be fatal. Theft and murder for ration cards became a constant danger. In a city already under bombardment, hunger introduced another form of violence, intimate, desperate, and close. Then the temperature fell. In the winter of 1941 to 42, the cold was not merely uncomfortable. It was a direct weapon added to famine. Temperatures regularly reached minus 20 degrees Celsius, and in some periods dropped toward minus 40. Apartments had little or no heat. Electricity was scarce. The trams stopped running. The starving had to walk through a frozen city because there was no other way to move. Every errand cost energy, and energy itself had become a dwindling reserve. To go out in search of food or water, to collect a ration, to check on a relative, to report for work, to drag fuel home, to bury the dead, each act consumed calories that many people could not replace. In that winter, even standing up became a survival decision. When fuel ran out, the city began to burn itself. People fed stoves with furniture, wardrobes, doors, shelves, and books. Homes were dismantled from the inside in order to remain barely habitable for another night. The objects of ordinary life, things built to make a room civilized, were reduced to heat, smoke, and ash. This was one of the hidden mechanics of survival in besieged Leningrad. Not everyone was wandering in ruins. Many were still inside their own apartments, surrounded by the remains of their own former lives, calculating what could be burned next without making shelter itself impossible. There was almost no line between preservation and self-destruction. To stay warm, people consumed their homes. Food became more desperate by the week. When the bread ration failed to sustain life, civilians turned to whatever could be swallowed. People ate wallpaper glue, petroleum jelly, boiled leather, rats, pigeons, and household pets. Some of these things offered almost no nutrition worth the effort. But hunger changes the meaning of food. Under normal conditions, disgust protects people from danger. Under famine, disgust becomes a luxury. There were also rumors and documented cases of cannibalism severe enough that the authorities arrested more than 2,000 people for it. That fact matters not because it is sensational, but because it shows what the siege did to the moral structure of everyday life. Hunger did not simply weaken bodies. It narrowed the world until all choices were terrible, and some people crossed lines they would never have imagined before the blockade. And still, the city did not die. One reason was Lake Ladoga. The Germans had cut the main land routes, but they had not fully denied the lake. In summer, barges brought in sparse supplies. In winter, when the water froze, trucks and sledges moved across the ice on what became known as the Road of Life. The name was not rhetorical. Without that route, the city's survival prospects would have collapsed further still. Food and fuel trickled in. Civilians, especially children, the elderly, and the sick, were evacuated in huge numbers. The figures vary by source, but the core fact does not. Hundreds of thousands were carried out over Ladoga, and many more might have died without that corridor. The road over the lake did not end the famine. It merely prevented something even worse. But in a city living at the edge of annihilation, not worse was the difference between endurance and extinction. Even so, relief came unevenly. The first winter remained catastrophic. Civilians collapsed in the streets from exhaustion or died at home in unheated rooms. Death became so common that it changed the texture of the city. The dead were no longer occasional tragedies. They were part of the landscape. When spring came, mass graves were dug to bury bodies and reduce the risk of epidemic disease. That detail can be easy to pass over, but it reveals the scale of the crisis more clearly than abstractions ever could. Survival in Leningrad did not only mean staying alive, it also meant living among the dead, moving around them, recognizing neighbors by silence rather than speech, and accepting that grief itself had to be compressed because there was too much of it. The siege is often remembered through military maps and casualty totals, but its deepest reality was domestic. It unfolded inside stairwells, kitchens, courtyards, bread queues, and hospital wards. It unfolded in families. One of the most haunting symbols of the blockade is the notebook of Tanya Savicheva, the young girl who recorded the deaths of her relatives one by one until only Tanya was left. Her diary became famous because it reduced a mass catastrophe to a few stark lines. But its importance lies in what it represented. Across Leningrad, survival was often experienced not as a heroic adventure, but as the gradual disappearance of the household. A family did not vanish in one explosion, it thinned. First one member stopped returning from a queue, then another stopped rising from bed. Then someone died in the next room while the others still had to stand in line for bread. The siege broke the city at the level of the home. Yet even that is not the whole story. If Leningrad had been a city of passive victims alone, it might not have held on. People survived not just through rationing and state control, but through improvisation, creativity, and social ties. Some scholars of the blockade stress that in moments of extreme duress, human behavior did not become purely noble or purely selfish. It became unstable, mixed, and intensely relational. There was opportunism, there was theft, there was black market dealing. There was also compassion, sharing, and family sacrifice. People clung to what one historian has called anchors: food, loved ones, routines, symbols, small obligations that kept life from dissolving entirely into chaos. That mattered because under siege, the mind can collapse before the body does. A person with no reason to get up in the morning is already in danger, even before starvation does its final work. For the survivors, routine became a form of resistance. Collect the ration, find fuel, check on relatives, report to work if still able. Queue again. In some cases, work itself became a survival structure. Leningrad's arms factories kept operating even through the famine. The labor force changed as death, evacuation, and military mobilization transformed the city, and by late stages, many factory workers were women. The city, astonishingly, did not simply starve in place, it continued to produce. That production had military value, but it also had psychological value. A functioning workshop, however limited, is proof that time still exists beyond the next meal. The authorities understood something similar when they tried to preserve fragments of normal civic life. Libraries remained open. Plays were performed. In August 1942, in one of the strangest and most defiant episodes of the siege, Shostakovich's Seventh Symphony was performed in Leningrad and broadcast toward the German lines. It is easy to treat this as symbolism, and it was symbolic. But it was also practical in a different way. A starving city that can still gather musicians and listeners is a city telling itself it has not yet become a graveyard. In the middle of famine, culture was not a luxury detached from survival. It was one of the ways people defended the idea that survival still meant something. By early 1942, the immediate crisis was still severe, but the city had begun to adapt. Evacuation reduced the number of mouths to feed. The Ladoga route, while dangerous and inadequate, continued functioning. When spring arrived, Leningraders cleaned rubble, buried the dead, and planted gardens in courtyards, parks, and open ground. That transformation matters more than it might seem. A besieged industrial city began turning itself into a patchwork of food plots. Open spaces became practical assets. The goal was not abundance, it was marginal gain. A few more potatoes, a few more vegetables, a little less absolute dependence on a failing ration system. By 1943, these urban gardens covered much of the available open land and helped ease the starvation that had nearly destroyed the city. Still, the blockade was not over. Shelling continued. Supplies remained tight. The city had survived the first great collapse, but not escaped it. This is one of the most important truths about Leningrad. There was no clean turning point where the suffering suddenly ended. Improvement came unevenly, with advances and setbacks, hope and disappointment. In January 1943, Soviet forces managed to rupture the German encirclement enough to reopen a more effective supply corridor along the southern shore of Lake Ladoga. That mattered enormously. It meant more food, more fuel, more connection. But even then, Leningrad was not free. The city remained under pressure, still wounded, still hungry, still within range of enemy fire. After surviving the deadliest winter, its people now faced the second psychological challenge of the siege, enduring after the worst had passed, but before safety had returned. By this stage, the moral landscape of the city had become more complicated, not less. Official discipline remained harsh. Police monitored public mood. Black market activity was punished. Theft of ration cards could bring the death penalty. Rumors circulated that some Soviet leaders were living far better than ordinary civilians. Historians still debate how much blame Soviet authorities deserve for failing to evacuate more people earlier or organize emergency supplies more effectively before the ring closed. These debates matter because they complicate the story. Leningrad was not saved by flawless administration. It was held together by a mix of state control, coercion, improvisation, sacrifice, and sheer civilian endurance. That is less comforting than a simple heroic narrative, but closer to the truth. And the truth is what makes the siege so difficult to absorb. Around 800,000 civilians are estimated to have died during the blockade, though figures varied depending on the source and the method of counting. Britannica notes that 650,000 Leningraders died in 1942 alone, mostly from starvation, exposure, disease, and shelling. That means the defining experience of the siege was not one decisive battle. It was slow attrition on a vast scale. The deadliest enemy was not always a soldier or a bomb. Often, it was the combined effect of cold room, weak body, empty stomach, and one more walk through the snow that the body could no longer afford. When the end finally came, it came through military pressure from outside, not because the civilians inside had somehow solved the famine on their own. On January 14, 1944, the Red Army launched the Leningrad-Novgorod offensive. By January 27th, the blockade was lifted. After 872 days, the city was no longer encircled. There were celebrations, of course. There was relief. There was also grief too large for triumph to erase. Too many had vanished. Too many apartments had emptied. Too many families had ended in silence. Freedom from the blockade did not restore the dead, or the lost years, or the bodies permanently damaged by starvation. What remained afterward was a city changed by what it had done to survive. It had burned its own furniture, planted gardens in its parks, walked through winter without trams, buried its dead in mass graves, carried children out over a frozen lake, and kept theaters and libraries alive while bodies failed in the streets. It had seen the ordinary rules of civilization collapse under hunger, and still, somehow, held on to enough structure to endure. That endurance would later be remembered, and sometimes simplified, as a story of pure heroism. But the fuller reality is harsher and more human than that. Leningrad survived through courage, yes, but also through rationing, coercion, luck, improvisation, sacrifice, black markets, grim discipline, and the stubborn refusal of millions of civilians to let the city disappear. That may be the most unsettling thing about the siege. It did not test a lone explorer in the wilderness, or a small crew adrift at sea. It tested an entire modern city. The survivors were not extraordinary because they mastered nature in some dramatic way. They were extraordinary because they endured conditions under which ordinary urban life became almost impossible. They had to learn that a chair could become heat, that a park could become a garden, that a lake could become a road, that culture could become a ration for the mind, and that survival sometimes meant living one day at a time in a place where the future had shrunk to almost nothing. Leningrad is often called the 900-day siege, though the blockade lasted 872 days in fact. The distinction matters to historians, but for the civilians who lived through it, the number was almost beside the point. What mattered was the duration as experience. One winter, then another spring, another queue, another funeral, another rumor, another ration, another day not dead. That is how the siege was lived, not as a rounded historical number, but as repetition under pressure. The city did not survive because suffering made people noble. It survived because enough people kept going while frightened, hungry, freezing, grieving, and uncertain. They kept going when there was no guarantee that endurance would be rewarded. They kept going before the breakthrough of 1943, and after it, and right up until the blockade was lifted in January 1944. And that is why the story remains so powerful. Not because it offers a clean lesson, but because it does not. It shows how survival in the modern world can depend on systems as much as on individuals, on roads and ration cards as much as on courage, on family bonds as much as on military operations. It shows a city where starvation and culture existed side by side, where the deadliest threat was often absence of food, of fuel, of transport, of certainty. And it shows that under those conditions, people did not become saints or monsters alone. They became what extreme pressure made possible. Frightened, compromised, determined, desperate, generous, exhausted, and still alive a little longer than seemed imaginable. For 872 days, Leningrad civilians endured bombardment, hunger, cold, and the slow destruction of the world they had known. Around them, a great city was reduced to its barest functions. Yet it did not vanish. When the blockade finally ended, what survived was not only territory, or industry, or military prestige. What survived was proof that even under one of the most lethal sieges in modern history, a city's people could remain human long enough to outlast the design to break them.